Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Geek Warning from the Escape Collective. I'm James Huang, and we're replacing our usual group show this week with a special Ask a Wrench episode where we take a whole bunch of gear-related questions exclusively from our Escape Collective members, and then we consult our hive mind for answers. Hopefully, we'll have good ones for you. Joining me on the panel today is Escape Collective tech editor Dave Rome in Sydney, Australia. Hello, Dave.
Hello.
We also have pro mechanic Zach Edwards sitting right next to me here of the Boulder Grupetto joining us. Hi, Zach.
Hello.
And last, and certainly not least, we've got former UCI World Cup and internet famous pro mechanic Brad Copeland here with us. Brad's now the service manager at Hush Money Bikes in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Brad, thanks for being with us again.
Thanks for having me again.
And I'm glad that we were able to overcome your computer issues.
It's always something.
Dave, it's been a whopping barely day or so since we're sort of double stacking some podcast recordings here. How many tools have you purchased in the last 24 hours?
Last 24 hours, actually none. I bought. The last purchase was a week ago now, so I think I'm doing quite well.
Are you feeling well?
Well, no, but that's not the point. I mean, I'm off to the US tomorrow, so which is also why we're doing why we've got this episode as opposed to the usual weekly show. We're recording this in advance, and I'm off to the US, and I was just saving a little bit of money so I can spend it there.
Okay, on a whole bunch of gluten-free scratch bars that I have waiting here for you now.
Yes.
Okay,
those are good.
Excellent. And Zach, I've actually always been wanting to ask you, do you recall what is the most expensive bill you've ever had to serve to a customer here?
The one that stands out was a Pinarello Boulder TT bike that was had all of the things you can do to a bicycle to make it more expensive.
And do you know how much that bill was?
I don't remember, but a lot. I mean, it was like the frame alone is 15, I think, if I remember. And we had lightweights and Di2 and SRM and ceramic speed and all of the things.
Did they elect for the coated ceramic speed, or did they go like the poor man ceramic speed without the coating?
Surely they went without the coating to save a little bit of money.
Yeah, I mean, it was like custom painted frame and everything, so it was very, very over the top.
Dear God.
Yeah.
All right then. That sounds like a big bill.
That's the one that stands out.
Huh. All right then. Well, okay. Before we start diving into questions, just a quick reminder that, again, all of these questions do come exclusively from our Escape Collective members, and everything that we do here is wholly funded by our members. So that means there's no ads, no sponsors, no confusion as to who we're doing all this for, which, to be clear, is all of you listening here. And if you haven't already done so, please consider signing up at escapecollective.com/join and maybe become a member of our community, because I don't know, I kind of think we're a pretty decent bunch. I think. Sure. The silence is
Brad's nodding
deafening.
in agreement.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for the support.
I'll take it. All right. On with the questions. Let's go ahead and dive right in. First one comes from Robert Barrows. Robert wants to know if there is a process for going from wax to regular lube. He's going the other way. He said he'll be deploying for 6-ish months a year, and his wife is not interested in taking her chain off to put in the crock pot. Dave, I believe you are our chain waxing resident expert. What are you going to say here?
I mean, the crock pot tells me that you're currently using melt-on wax, and my advice would just be to go straight to a drip-on wax. There's plenty of good ones out there. Ceramic Speed do a great one. Silka, even like Squirt is probably the most readily available. But yeah, there's quite a few great drip-on waxes which now almost replicate the benefits of melt-on wax, and that to me would be the obvious first choice, because you've just put your wax in a bottle and you keep using it. The only catch is that stuff tends to need quite a few hours to dry onto the chain. So some dry within a few hours, others require like overnight. But to me, that would be where I'd go. But yeah, like if you did want to say go to an oil-based wax, you'd basically just pour boiling water over the chain, over the melt, like the hot melt wax chain, and that would strip out the wax, and you can straight away just put an oil over the top of it. Brad, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a diehard user of the UFO drip, the ceramic speed lube. Anyway, So I would just echo basically what you said. It might take 1 or 2 applications to sort of flush the old and fully coat with the new, but that shouldn't actually affect the performance if you're not measuring it on some kind of device that's telling you the fractions of a watt that you're saving or not. So yeah, I would just stick to dry lubes unless you want to just go through a full stripping process. And I actually like that technique, Dave, that you described using boiling hot water. That's a good one, a simple one. Sometimes that's the best way, simple and water-based.
Yes.
And it sounds like easy is definitely the goal here.
Yes.
But Dave, in regards to your comment about how long different wax-based lubes take to dry, what I usually recommend, and this is sometimes kind of a hard habit for people to get into, but I usually recommend that people use a wax drip lube or get in the habit of using a wax drip lube at the end of a ride after you get home, so that it's ready to go when you need to ride the next time. Just be done with it. Then you don't have to worry about it if it's dry or not.
Yeah. Or do what I do and just have too many bikes. And then when you forget to lube your chain, you just lube it and then grab a different bike.
Yes, there is that solution as well. All right. Well, Robert, thanks for your question. Next one, the way I've bundled these, I've kind of sorted some of these in groups here. This one comes from Dr. Tallrider. Sorry, I don't have Dr. Tallrider's name. I do know that Dr. Tallrider is in Northern California. It says, my wife's and my commute bikes are both waxed chains, and I'm wondering if I could alternate squirt applications with pot wax. And I think we kind of just answered that. And the answer would be yes.
Can I clarify? Like, squirt's probably not the best lube to be putting into your pot wax because it's very high on like I believe it's mineral oil. But yeah, it's very high. It's oily as far as wax chain lubes go. So there's better ones that will degrade your wax less. So again, Ceramic Speed, Silca is very good in that regard. Rex does one. But yeah, the squirt will work, but it's not the best option because it's quite gummy.
Yeah, in my experience, I do like squirt, and like you said, Dave, it is generally the most readily available out of any of the wax lubes that are out right now. Maybe because they've been around longer. But it does tend to build up a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I do like about it, however, is I do find that chains that are treated with squirt wax lube kind of tend to run quieter because it is a little bit gummier. So I feel like for people who maybe are okay with doing a little bit more, somewhat more frequent cleaning or are willing to kind of just wipe things down a little bit more often, it's a little bit gummier, maybe gets a little bit dirtier as well, but also runs quieter. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for. If you're okay with, I don't know, like not saving every last watt, then I think squirt's probably not a terrible idea.
Yeah. I like Smooth, which is the other South African wax chain lube, which kind of came after squirt. But yeah, it's even harder to find. But yeah, it's readily available in Australia, so that's my preference. It's just a little bit. I just find it a little bit cleaner running, a little bit smoother than squirt.
Smoother?
Yes.
Thank
you, Brad.
Do you think the Smooth and squirt people are friends?
I would say not. Is my assumption. I think they probably don't go to the same parties. Is my guess.
All right, our next round of questions. Actually, I've got 3 questions here from member Bernie Langer in Pennsylvania. We're going to address all 3 of these, Bernie. First one, I'm really curious to hear your takes on this. Bernie wants to know if you put greasy rags in the laundry. He said he's kind of treated rags that touch the drivetrain as the equivalent of nuclear waste, but he's wondering if maybe they won't forever irradiate his washing machine. What do you all do?
I mean, I wouldn't do that in my own washing machine.
Yeah, not my own.
I have a teenage Dave quip on this. Is my parents had gone on holiday and left me to the house, and I thought that was the perfect opportunity to wash all my rags.
Oh no!
And I can tell you that it doesn't do well to the washing machine.
Yeah.
There were grease marks on many clothes for many washes after that. So yeah, don't do that.
I can only imagine the conversation that happened in that household.
Yeah, well, thankfully I worked out what I'd done before they got back. So I was busy washing out the washing machine. But yeah, I think I ruined a towel or something trying to fix it.
Nice.
So yeah,
Did the rags come out clean?
what's that? No, not even. Much. I was able to reuse them, but I was so stressed about what I'd done that I can't remember what I did with the rags. I think I might have used the rags to clean the washing machine. To be honest.
I will say that I have done this, and I've done this fairly recently too, but not necessarily with greasy rags. So greasy rags always go into the trash. Definitely not in like a sealed container sort of thing, because I don't really want things to catch on fire. But actually, I can't remember now. Is it supposed to go in a sealed container or not sealed container?
I mean, if it's sealed, it's not going to catch on fire because there's no air.
True. There is something about like grease-soaked rags that can spontaneously combust, though. Anyway, I don't ever have enough that I have to worry about that. Anyway, point being, I have done that before. But anything that's super greasy or oily, I just throw those away. I do, however, wash rags that are just kind of like grimy. So those I don't really find to be that big of a deal. But I maybe put in a little bit extra detergent, and I don't wash them with whites. So, all right. Well, that one's settled. Next one from Bernie. It's sort of related, kind of. Bernie wants to know, how many uses can you get out of a pack of Silco hot wax?
I feel like these all seem like chain waxing questions for Dave.
Well, I intentionally bundled some of these together just so we can kind of get them out of the way.
It's for Dave to wax philosophical. Do you see what I did?
Very good.
Brad,
Very good, Brad.
You and Dave are cut from a similar cloth here.
I know.
The hot melt, it's tough. I don't know what Silco officially recommends, but basically you can, they normally give like a rough distance. I think it's like 10 to 15,000 K of repeated use. For me, it's I would say when the wax starts to look dirty when you stir it up, when there's any kind of contamination, then I would be looking to replace that pot of wax. That's my go. Or along the way, if you've overheated it, it'll sort of yellow as well, and then that's a sign you've kind of cooked it, so to speak. So I'd also replace it at that point.
I guess the way that I've always treated hot wax is, yes, Dave, as long as you mentioned, as long as it's not been overheated or too dirty, I basically use it until it's pretty much gone. Which you can put a chain in there an awful lot, and a chain really just turns out it doesn't absorb that much wax per treatment. So a bag of wax goes a pretty long way. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I want to remind people of is, you get that huge bag of wax, and the natural thing is to just dump the whole thing into the crock pot. One thing you could do is just not dump all of it in. So make sure it's nice and mixed, nice and thoroughly and kind of evenly mixed in the bag. And then just pour in maybe even like a quarter or a half of it, basically just as much as you need to immerse the whole chain. And then run it like that, because then at that point, if you do get a batch dirty, you don't contaminate like the entire batch all at once.
Yeah, that would definitely depend on the crock pot you're using and whether you can submerge a chain in that small amount of wax. But yeah, it's definitely an option. And if you can do that, then it would obviously be quicker to heat up as well. So it's got a benefit there too. So.
Totally. Last question from Bernie, and yes, this is going to be, I think, our last chain waxing question. If you rewax your chain with hot melt each time, doesn't that just wear out your quick link? So is drip wax a better technique for topping off? Oh, this is an easy one. Dave, I'm going to go ahead and toss you this softball here.
Well, yeah, your quick link definitely wears out. So they're not infinitely replaceable. SRAM and Shimano, for all of their quick links from 11 speed or 10 speed and up, actually say they're not reusable at all officially. So and Brad's nodding. I know Brad wouldn't reuse
and smiling.
Yeah. So I know Brad wouldn't reuse a quick link in a race situation.
He would never think about it.
Yeah, but
I would any other time though.
Yeah, and on like a personal bike. So. But yeah, normally you'd reuse them up until the point where they no longer make that snap when you join them. So at that point they're worn out. That certainly factors into it with like 12 speed links being so expensive these days, and being you only get 2 or 3 uses out of them before that snap goes away. So for me personally, like on my mountain bike, which is using 12 speed XTR, I actually do just use a drip lube for that reason. I'm just using like ceramic speed UFO, and it works very well, and saves quick links.
All right, enough with the chain waxing questions. The next question comes from David Savage in Indianapolis, Indiana. David wants to know.
Hoosiers. I said Hoosiers.
Indeed.
Yes.
Which fully internal cable routing system, either a widely used one like FSA's or a manufacturer-specific one, is the easiest to work on these days?
I mean, I would say it depends what your definition of easy is. Is it like easy to install the first time or easy to make adjustments with down the road? Like, what are we talking easy?
Yes.
All of it. I mean, I would say not the FSA one that he called out.
Yeah. What would you want on your own bike? Like, what if you were to pick a bike? Which one would you be picking based on?
I mean, I would say I like the Specialized one the most, where they run, and a couple other companies like BMC did it for a bit, but basically where they run the brake hoses underneath the stem, and then either into the bar if it's internally routed, or just tape next to the bar if you're running a normal like round handlebar. Because that you can adjust the stem up and down, you can take it off to travel, you can change stem lengths within reason of brake hose lengths. I would say that's the most, like, that style is the most user friendly.
Yeah, I mean, they did, like, if you get the latest S-Works with the Rapide cockpit,
I installed one of those today.
Yeah, that's through the stem, right? Now?
It goes underneath.
Oh.
It goes under and then into the bar, which I thought was really nice. Because usually it's like you're shoving it through a tiny hole in the back from the steer, and then you're like trying to make the brake hose do a 90-degree bend in the bar, which is somewhere where you can't access, and then try and fish it out at the other end, where the Rapide bar, it goes in kind of, similar to how it was before, where it goes along underneath the stem and then into a hole, and was very effortless to install.
The other thing I'd say with that Specialized, I just built an SL8 with the old Rapide handlebar and SL7 stem. The routing through the handlebar is really nice, like really nice, smooth entry and exit points for the hoses.
It's just like a Madewell bar. It's not full of bladder material and
and those exit points are like actually manageable. You can actually get tools in there and like a pick in there and grab the hose. It's quite nice.
I feel like generally speaking, we can probably all agree that the ones that are easiest to either build or work on are the ones where the lines don't go through the steerer. So they don't go like up through the middle of the fork. And they don't run through the stem. Usually I think we probably all prefer that they run on the underside of the stem. And then I generally prefer that the hose runs externally on the bar underneath tape, although that's not very common with Aero type bars. So that's kind of a hit or miss sort of thing.
Yeah, like the Trek is the only one really that is external with an Aero bar.
Yep, which is why I like it.
Yeah, that one is nice, but it's also really particular to hose length. So you can't leave a lot of excess for, I don't know, future having to take things apart and put it back together.
Well, clearly what you need are like stretchable hoses. Oh wait, that's not going to work. All right. Well, David, that's our answer for that. Hopefully that gives you some info. So it's not like necessarily super specific as far as like manufacturers or brands, that sort of thing, but hopefully that's pretty helpful. Next question comes from Carl Seacrest here in Boulder, actually. What's your favorite tool to crimp cable tips with? Dave, I know your answer.
No, I'm looking at Brad because him and his friend Greg Thomas inspired a purchase of mine. So Brad.
So this is, again, it's one of those questions of is it worth it, which is something we probably all ask ourselves frequently when it comes to buying tools. But my friend Greg Thomas, a guy I worked with for a number of years, and it's one of my close contacts still, found a tool called a ring marking plier. It's a jeweler's tool, which you used. It's basically a plier that you stamp something of your choosing into soft metal. So we got and this was a wedding present he gave to me for my wedding, because we joked about it for years, but never ponied up and actually bought it because it costs like $300. But it's mostly the insert that costs a lot of money to make, but it's my name, Brad, B-R-A-D. If you have a very long name, this might not work as well for you, but if you have a few letters like Dave or Brad or Greg, you'll notice only 4 letters works well, and you can have a tool made where it crimps your name into the cable tip. So it's something I don't use on every bike, so I don't want to wear it out on, mid-level bikes that are not so significant. But for special builds, race bikes, my own bikes, and fancy things, I will claim it with my own cable tip. Although nowadays it's getting fewer and farther between when a bike of that level even has a cable in the first place. So lockout levers are about the last places we had mechanical cables with cable tips anymore. So
so Brad, you might as well just use it all the time. Like, what do you have to
might
lose
as well,
at this point,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. What if Carl is on kind of a more realistic budget and doesn't necessarily want to put his name on
he's
stuff?
got a short
But
name.
it is a four-letter name, right? It is a four-letter name.
C-A-R-L or K. I don't know.
Mine actually says Rome, but yeah,
that works too.
But yeah, I've actually I used to always use a blunt pair of diagonal cutters, and you just like do like 3 lines across. I know some people put like, arrows or something, crimp an arrow in. That's a really good tool because you can get it in at awkward angles. But I've actually quite taken to liking the new dedicated crimping tool from Park Tool lately, which is somewhat of like a generic crimping tool, but it's I like it because you can crimp either from the side of the plier or from like the straight on from the tips, and it means you can get in like into like Shimano GRX or road derailleurs where you kind of need to get behind the derailleur, between the wheel and the derailleur cage. And it's just a very convenient way to access the cable without having to like take out a wheel or anything like that. So that's my preference.
Zach?
I mean, I, similar to Dave, use a pair of dull like side cuts. If they're sharp, sometimes you can go straight through it. I prefer those. I just think it looks a little bit cleaner with just a nice line rather than some of the tools that are made to cut it, where it kind of flattens the whole thing. It just looks like it's came out of the factory in Asia and has a 6-inch long cable. Is what that always reminds me of. So I don't like that. I would say I also always really prefer, because there's usually a shift and a brake cable tip for different sizes. I like to use the shift ones on everything because they're just
they fit
much tidier rather than the big bulky brake ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, same. I will add that there is a very fancy Deutsch crimping plier out, which is used by electricians, which actually crimps 360-degree circles around the crimp.
Ooh.
And it'll do like multiple lines at once. So you get like 3 perfect 360-degree circles around. I have played with them. I own a cheap one from AliExpress. It is so bulky that you basically have to disassemble the bike in order to use it anyway. So it's just not practical.
Which is exactly why you have it, Dave. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we've answered that question more or less, and certainly with a bunch of suggestions that you shouldn't follow, Carl. All right, next question. It's another tool question here. This one comes from Sam. I apologize, I don't have Sam's last name, but Sam is in the market for a housing cutter for their personal toolbox. They've got a Knipex cutter sitting in their Amazon Save for Later list. Sam also has the Jaguar Pro cutter in their bench at work, and they're pretty satisfied with it, apparently. Sam is also eyeing up the Hosan cutter, and they're having trouble making a decision. What do we have for opinions and recommendations?
Brad?
I have some opinions. So one of my favorite tools ever, and the first housing cutter that I loved, was from Felco. I'm sure we've probably seen them in shops, those of us on the call right now. Those things are good for brake housing and shift housing. They're super high quality and last forever. I did just get the wire rope cutter from Knipex about 2 years ago, and I kept that one in my travel box, and that thing is also super good. It's kind of only for shift housing specifically, but it works incredibly well, as do most Knipex products in general. So I would go with one of those two.
So I'd like to toss in maybe an outlier suggestion here, Dave. I know you've heard this before, but I am still a huge fan of my 6-inch Knipex bolt cutters. There were a going away present from. I know. There were a going away present from one of the first shops I worked at in Michigan. They are definitely not specific to anything, but they are so old that they were actually made in West Germany, not Germany.
Ooh.
Yeah, they are vintage at this point, but they're still so sharp. I can cut paper with them. But I actually use them for brake housing, derailleur housing, and crimping cables and inner cables. I've actually used them to cut chain, and it works for all that stuff. And I don't need like 9 different tools.
You might not
You
need them, but you
probably
should
use it
have
for a
9
hammer
different tools.
too.
I
just
could
whack
probably
them.
use it for a hammer
It's
if,
like
if
the
need
gravel
be.
bike of cable cutters.
It is maybe, but it brings me so much joy, Zach.
James just mentioned not needing 9 different tools almost like it was a benefit. I don't understand it.
Know your audience, James.
I personally, so Knipex they have various different like Bowden cable cutters, which Brad mentioned before. There's like 3 different models, and I personally use 2 different models on my in my little workshop. One for inner cables, one for housing, because the jaw shapes are different, and they do a specific one for like inner wire that doesn't fray the inner wire as much because it's got like a more circular jaw. In that sense, it's probably a bit more like the Felco cutter. But yeah, for the travel box, I just have 1 pair of Knipex's newer plier, which I happen to have just brought up the model number for, which is a 9562160 for anyone playing at home. So there you go.
Okay, of course you have that model number. This next question, actually, this is another one from Carl in Boulder. Actually, kind of is a nice little segue from what I was mentioning with those Knipex bolt cutters. Carl wants to know, how many tools do we use that have been repurposed from obsolete equipment? He said the big one that comes to mind is toe straps. Anyone?
I mean, toe straps are great, but
They're
I'd
pretty
say
amazing.
like probably the most common, like in every bike shop, is people using spokes for various other things.
This is an example of something that I reuse. That's not necessarily for bike use per se, but one thing I have found really handy is an old section of cable and housing for like unclogging drains. Like, it's, you know how I'm sure all of us have pricked our finger on like a little strand of inner wire, and and for some reason it's so painful. But if you take one of those wires and like intentionally kind of like curl up the ends and kind of like, you know, undo all the strands up there and hook them and kind of just curl them out, it is amazing for pulling hair out of drains. Like the best thing ever.
Good tip. On the topic of reusing old redundant components, I saw one on Instagram. Normally, like the hacks on Instagram are just hilarious and good for a laugh. But this one actually had me intrigued, which was to use. They basically got an old handlebar and a quill stem, and they put the quill stem into like the seat post was stuck in the bike, and the head, like the clamp of the topper of the seat post had fallen off, or maybe they'd cut it off, and they used the quill stem and they bolted it expanded it into the seat post, and were able to pull the seat post out.
Wow, that's a good idea. I like that one.
Yeah, so you got like the leverage of the handlebars. So that's one I might try do myself at some point.
Huh? That seems like a good reason to take an old bike and just leave it submerged in the ocean somewhere for a while. Huh?
Yeah.
All right. Next tool question. This is another one. I don't have the person's name. This one comes from Escape Collective member W. Denman. So sorry, don't know your name. But they help run the on-campus community bike lab that allows students to repair bikes with the help of others. They've started getting disc brakes for repair now, and most of the bikes are big box store bikes that they attempt to service in a safe way. And they're curious what tools they should buy for the shop. They know they need tools for SRAM and Shimano, but they're also curious if there's one that does both. And he's talking about brakes here, disc brakes. They have bleed kits that have been donated, looking for something that isn't too expensive because tools seem to walk off, but that can also survive light shop use. They're hoping that they can find something that would work on a wide range of brakes, but of the cheaper variety. And yeah, probably not really any need to work on any of the high-end stuff. So, Dave, I know that there are kind of universal brake bleed kits that are out there, but I'm not familiar with what sort of fittings they might include for stuff like, I don't know, like Pro Max and Tektro and stuff like that.
Yeah, the good universal kits come with it all, because there's not that much variance in the threads, like the thread fitments between those brakes. Like, you know, a lot of those brakes are from the same manufacturer, even if the brand name's different on them. Where you can't overlap though is that you got to be really careful with the dot fluid versus mineral oil, and not to cross contaminate there. So I'd really recommend 2 separate universal kits, just so there's no risk of contaminating the brakes, because you definitely don't want to accidentally put the wrong fluid, even small amounts of the wrong fluid in the wrong brake, because that'll quickly ruin the brake. So but yeah, like there's Park Tool and Jaguar have very high end universal kits, but the internet's full of more, bleakit.com, for example, do quite good value universal kits, which would be up for occasional use in this sort of environment. So you don't have to spend a huge amount to get a universal kit that could do it all.
Bleedkit.com. I'll have to check that out.
Brad, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say the same about Jaguar, and I think Finish Line may also do one. I have to review whether that's accurate. I know Jaguar does, though, and they have one with like different fittings for example, Magura or TRP, Tektro, and then obviously the Shimano and SRAM fittings, and the little tips that make it fit one or the other thread onto sort of a universal syringe type apparatus. Looks basically just like a SRAM one for the most part. And then you just screw on the tip that you need to fit into whichever brake brand you're working on. So I would echo, again, be really careful to clean them super thoroughly, or get 2 if you're going back and forth between dot and mineral. But otherwise I found that to be a pretty handy thing. That's what we have in our shop. And we only do, occasional things that aren't SRAM or Shimano. I'm sure like most of us, that's primarily what we see. And so that's like a handy one that just kind of takes care of those oddball brakes that we don't see every day.
All right. Sounds good. Interesting. Sticking with the topic of brakes, this question comes from Al Boflick. Is bedding in new Shimano metallic disc brake pads on an Ultegra brake still a thing these days? Because Al feels like there's not really a huge difference if you do it or don't do it, and just go ahead and start riding, because it seems like they'll bite pretty well. It seems like they'll bite pretty well anyway. What do we think about this?
For me, I still like to do at least a cursory bed-in process on new bikes at the shop. You don't necessarily need to go to the T on the manufacturer spec and do 30 stops and do it like that. But what I find especially useful in terms of bedding in a new brake and a new brake rotor is to do like some even, consistent stops where you're not like hard on the brake like you would be if you're coming to a kind of emergency stop, or even a stop at like a intersection. Just so you get that initial bedding kind of nice and consistent and even as you have a little bit of pad material exchange between the rotor and the pads. And so once you do that way you kind of avoid that pulsy brake feeling, which you can sometimes get if you just start with new stuff and just kind of ride them in whatever conditions you're riding them in.
Yeah, this question's interesting because it might be from the point of view of just replacing pads and not the rotor. So you at that point you're using a rotor that already has that material deposit onto it. So all you're then having to do is sort of get that initial surface right on the pads. So that might be why you're experiencing why you don't think it makes a difference, like why riding's just producing the same results for you. But yeah, certainly if it's a new rotor, then you basically want to repeat the whole bed-in process that Brad just described.
So I guess long answer short, the brakes will still work if you don't do a proper bed-in, but they'll probably work better if you do. So it doesn't take a whole lot of time. So I think we'd still recommend doing a proper bed-in process. Sure would be nice if maybe we should go ahead and put together like an article on how to bed in brakes, huh? What do you think, Dave? Dave, what do you think?
I have like 1,000 words from Brad alone on this already. It's probably, hopefully I'm not sleeping on the plane and I can actually finally finish this article.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'm gonna see if I can get a hold of the flight attendants on that flight and just have them plaster you with coffee for the whole flight.
Yeah. So
excellent. All right, next question. This one comes from Marty. Again, I don't know their full name. This is just what their handle was on the Discord channel here. But they're trying to install a dropper post on a 2021 Orbea Alma. And routing the cable housing is proving harder than expected. The head tube cable port's very tight and only barely fits the housing. And any magnets that they have in their routing kit don't really fit. And then without using magnets and trying to fish out the bare housing from the seat tube seems pretty hard too. He said there's a little hole at the bottom bracket area. They tried sticking an Allen key in there to push the housing toward the seat tube, but it's too small to do anything useful from there. And they're wondering, unless they're missing something, is taking the bottom bracket out the only option left, which would be kind of annoying since it's press fit and the bike's almost new. I'm just going to go ahead and grab this one here, having done this a whole bunch of times on a bunch of different bikes. In that sort of situation, I would have to say that removing the bottom bracket, as much as it seems like a pain in the butt, it is the most surefire way to just get it done and have it be over with. Because otherwise, it sounds like you're going through a fair bit of frustration already. And I would say that assuming you have the correct tools to remove and reinstall that press fit bottom bracket, it probably would be quicker to just go ahead and do that and kind of like get your fingers in there and guide it back up into the C-tube and then just be done with it. Brad, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Having done it the other way where I'm like, surely I can just somehow do this without taking everything apart. Usually it would have been a lot faster if I just took it apart. If it's possible, sometimes you can feed a cable, just a bare inner cable through the frame and use that to then kind of guide the housing. That would be my only other suggestion. What I'll often do is like kink the cable itself. So when you stick it into the housing, it's got some like expansion kind of tension from within the housing, so you can kind of have something to pull against before you just pull the cable right out. Maybe a little careful bending if you can kind of figure the length out where it kind of hits the curve underneath the BB. Maybe put a little curve in the housing as well to help it make that turn and not snag an edge. But to James' point, more than likely, you'll wish you just took the BB out in the first place.
Yeah, almost always easier just to take it out.
Yeah.
And just be thankful it's not an e-bike where you're having to take the motor out.
Oh my God, yes.
And then you crimp it somehow in the motor when you put it back together. Joy.
The joys of modern bike mechanic stuff. All right, this next question comes from John Chenier in Everett, Washington. John's having a whole bunch of trouble keeping their headset properly tightened. They can't figure out the issue. John built up the bike himself. It's a Chapter 2 Rare, just so we know. So he's worried that it's his own fault. It's a carbon frame and steerer, normal bearings and everything. So the bike came with an expansion plug that's maybe an inch long that sits on top of the steerer. He's got all the bearings and fork all in place correctly. Put the stem and spacers on. He's got the expander plug in there with some carbon grip paste. It's all tightened to spec. Installed the top cap snugly without affecting the fork rotation, and then tightened the stem bolts to spec. It's fine basically when he's working on it, but then it develops a little play within a few long rides. I did check with him just to first little bit of extra clarification here. He has ridden it. He said briefly / occasionally with a loose headset, but he says that there's no sign of a ring of death as far as he can tell, and he's checking regularly. This is an interesting one. So basically his headset keeps coming loose. What do we think here, Zach?
I mean, that sounds like the steer tube is like right at that length where it feels like it's tight, and then you get some weight on the bike and it all kind of settles in and it's not actually tight. So like the steer tube, my guess, probably needs cut, I don't know, 1 or 2 millimeters.
Or a spacer added.
Or put a spacer on if the stem allows you.
That was also my hunch, was that, sometimes if you cut it, especially if you cut it measuring without the compression plug in the steerer, then you add that plug, you add another mil or so to the top of the steer tube, and then if there's a little bulge or something underneath where the bolt sits on the top cap of the stem, sometimes that's enough where it can just make contact and it gives you the essence of preload, and it feels normal in the shop, and you go ride it and things kind of shake into place and you're back to that loose feeling. That would be my speculation.
That's a good one. What if we assume that the steer tube is not slightly too long and he does not need any extra spacers and it's still coming loose? Do we have any recommendations there? Because I'm glad he mentioned that he does not have the little ring of death thing there, because that would have been my first thought. But he did mention that he's basically just tightening the preload bolt so that he doesn't feel any play. But should he tighten it any more than that?
Well, I would make sure that first that maybe just as a test, like what Dave said, just put a spacer above it just to give you that gap, so you know that there's some gap there, so that there's definitely no bottom out contact from the top cap of, in the compression plug or the top of the steer or whatever the case. Just test it like that. Just put a 5 mil spacer or something up there and see if that fixes it. Otherwise, I would maybe say try a different compression plug just to eliminate that variable.
Yeah, I've seen too where if the compression plug isn't fully tightened, it'll feel like you're tightening the headset, but instead of actually compressing the headset, it just pulls the plug up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess on the topic of potentially needing a headset, one thing that's kind of funny is it might seem like you have a steer tube cut to the right length and leaving enough gap between the top of the steer, even with the plug, and the top of the stem. But depending on how that top cap is shaped on the underside, sometimes you actually need a little bit more room than you think you do, especially if the inner diameter of that plug is kind of small. Then it can interfere with the underside of the top cap more than you might think. So adding a spacer is definitely a very easy and safe way to go just to find out what's going on.
Yeah, and then in really extreme cases, I'd say like if you've done all of that, then in extreme cases you start to look at things like whether the bearing surfaces are square and appropriate, and it gets pretty complicated pretty quick. And at that point, I'd probably be dealing with the manufacturer rather than trying to chase it. But yeah,
gotcha.
There was an interesting scenario with Scott frames where the provided the headset bearing was a little bit undersized relative to the upper bearing seat in the frame. So no matter what, it would develop some jiggly feelings eventually. And some guys were telling me they were using rim tape, like tubeless rim tape, just one single strip around the sort of outer diameter of the bearing. I'm not saying you should, but I'm saying maybe you could. But yeah, to Dave's point, I would say the only, if these things don't fix it, it may be an intolerance in the manufacturing.
John, I hope that answers your question. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe follow up with us on the Discord channel and let us know what you found out here. So we'd be happy to continue to walk you through this if need be. Next question comes from Mark Rogers in Alexandria, Virginia. Mark's the original owner of a 2003 Le Mans Victoire. Ooh. He said it's about 16 years and 55,000 miles. He started worrying about the fork. Maybe as you should, Mark. That's a long time. He thinks it's the same one that came with the Le Mans Maillot Jaune that I have. It's a Bond Trigger Race-like carbon. Its fork's got a bonded aluminum steer, bonded dropout, carbon legs. He's finding no good advice on the durability and aging of the bonds. And just as COVID was arriving, he replaced the fork with an Envy road fork. Got two questions. He said, is he unjustly concerned about the bonds as there are no signs of weakness or looseness? And can he safely trust that fork? And then two, he said the Envy manual sets the maximum distance from the top of the headset bearing to the bottom of the stem clamp at 40 millimeters. He said, what do we think about this? And he said his stem is actually less than the 40 millimeter max, so it's kind of more of an academic question. So, I'm going to address the second question first. I would just say that there are an awful lot of variables that come along with some of those manufacturer recommendations. So, I'm not sure we can actually answer that. I'm not even saying this from like a liability standpoint or anything like that. I'm not sure we can answer that like accurately.
I can tell you why they suggest that though, which is it's to do with the length of unsupported steerer. So like the stem clamp kind of adds some reinforcement, and then the headset bearing and the head tube adds some support to the steerer. So, but those spaces are basically just like a hollow tube generally with like no support to the steerer. So the manufacturers try to limit that amount because it does create a zone that could like a high leverage zone that could cause steerer failure from. So it is good to follow the advice of the fork manufacturers and the bike manufacturers in that regard, because often they've done the testing and they sort of know the safe limits of those products.
Yeah, and it probably has a little to do with the depth of the compression plug in use too, which would support about 40 mils of steerer inside, and beyond that you have kind of like a stress point where there's a lot of forces being applied there. So
yeah,
it's maybe not something you want to test and find out you went too long, because consequences are dire.
Yeah. As someone who has gone through the entire process of dental implant surgery, I would not advise testing the theory.
Yes.
To address the first part of the question, though, I bought that frame used, and that fork actually was cut too short, so I actually never rode it. But I actually ended up replacing my fork straight away with a Reynolds Uzo Pro that I thankfully got from Matt Phillips at Bicycling Magazine. He had one that was virtually unused, that had the correct dimensions and rake and everything. So thank you, Matt. I don't think your I don't think your concerns are unwarranted. I would certainly bikes of that generation that were made with bonded aluminum and carbon components maybe aren't always the most reliable, especially over that period of time. And who knows what it's been exposed to in terms of weather and moisture and that sort of thing. Usually if you see some signs of, usually if there is some galvanic corrosion, you'll see some like bubbling in the clear coat around the joint. But even if you don't see that, this is the sort of thing where I would just play it safe. If you are concerned about it, if you're worried about it, even if you didn't see any signs that anything was happening, I would imagine I would anyway, just sort of feel better riding the thing, just not having that sitting in the back of my mind. So you already got an NV fork. I would just leave it on there and call it good.
My only added thought to that is that fork is an aluminium steerer, and metal doesn't have an infinite lifespan. So I'd probably be more worried about the aluminium steerer fatiguing than I would about the bonds between the carbon and the aluminium. So that alone would be cause to replace it after that sort of distance.
Yeah, and also that NV fork is going to be heaps lighter than that original Bontrager Race Light. And I will say from experience, certainly at least the first time I owned that bike originally when it was new, the NV fork would ride a lot better. So that Victoire, it's a nice TIG welded. If I remember correctly, it's a Reynolds titanium frame, and rides very nicely. And that NV fork should be nothing but an improvement over the original. So yeah, I would just run what you got and be happy with it, and just maybe keep the old one as a souvenir. All right, moving on. This is an interesting question. This one comes from Mark Lynn in Sydney. Mark had their mechanic fit a SRAM GXP BB86 bottom bracket to their giant TCR the other day to fit some force axis cranks. He said the mechanic told him that those things are notoriously stiff to start out and will loosen up after some riding. However, under 80 load whatsoever, the thing creaks and cracks along like crazy. Mark is wondering if this is normal or will it gradually go away as the bottom bracket is worn in. He's only ridden about 20K on it so far, and he's almost too embarrassed to ride anymore because it's so noisy. Mark actually did post a little video clip of this thing, and I can confirm that it is very loud and clicky and noisy. And this might sound a little bit harsh, Mark, but I would find a new mechanic, because there is absolutely no good reason whatsoever that bottom bracket shouldn't be running pretty smoothly straight away. So I'm not saying that there isn't maybe something wrong with that bottom bracket, or maybe even potentially your frame, depending on the bottom bracket dimensions, as far as the shell anyway. But that bike shouldn't have gotten back to you like that.
It wasn't me, for the record.
That'd be really funny if it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if it's creaking already from the get-go, like that's not just going to go away over time.
No, and it's not just creaking. It's like loud ticking and it's barely spinning. Like there's something wrong there. Something happened during that installation that was incorrect. So I would go straight back to that shop and be like, no, this is not how it's supposed to be, and fix it.
Yeah. There is a slight amount of truth to what was said, which is bottom brackets do wear in, like the seals do break in and the grease loosens. So a bottom bracket that's brand new, like a bottom bracket that's been ridden for a couple of months, will probably spin smoother than one that's brand new. Like you'll get a couple more rotations out of the crank, but it shouldn't make any noise at all from new. Like no, that's not a thing. And
it shouldn't require like tangible, substantial effort to turn the thing. Like that's just
absolutely not
right.
No, you should still be able to spin the crank. Yeah.
Yes. So it should normally go from like smooth to smoother.
Yeah.
Not necessarily barely functioning to functioning.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly I would say too, like with GXP, I see a lot of people mess up spacers on them. So like that's probably what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of it not spinning. The creaking, that's
like
probably something
too
else,
much preload on the bearing with too many spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, and then maybe by tightening it all the way with too many spacers, that you've sort of overdone the bearings in terms of preload. Now they're broken.
I'd be curious. So like on the drive side on a GXP press fit, like on this frame, there should be a wavy washer in between the crank and the bottom bracket. And I'd be really curious if that is there and you can see it, or if there's a bunch of other washers shoved in there and that washer is just like fully flattened.
Yeah. Either way, there's definitely a bunch of different ways this could have gone wrong. And it sounds like one of those things went wrong. So
or more.
Yeah, or more. But either way, Mark, that is definitely not correct. Take the thing back. All right, this is an interesting one. This one comes from Discord user Lugs585. I'm guessing they have a look. Anyway, they recently went to service their partner's time fluidity headset bearings. They were astounded to see that the bearings were not a classic metal or plastic cage containing the individual ball bearings, but instead the ball bearings were set in a thin silicone ring, which makes them fixed and unable to roll individually. The bearing still functions, and the time quickset adjustment is fantastic. But you can't help but imagine that these fixed balls are just wearing a track in the races. Has anyone come across this type before? I'm going to guess that this person hasn't really looked inside of a whole bunch of modern bearings in a while, because it's actually very, very common now. It's certainly more common than not, I would say, for a cartridge bearing to have the bearing balls encased in some sort of like oftentimes a plastic ring like that. It keeps the bearings spaced apart from each other, and it keeps the bearings themselves from counter-rotating against each other, which is a big source of wear. So unless something is not rotating well or is seized or something like that, I think what you're looking at is totally normal, actually. Anyone else have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it sounds like. I mean, like even like Ceramic Speed's new bearing is that, but like to the extreme, right? Like it's meant to fill all the space so that there's no dirt or anything that can get in. But like under load, those ball bearings still spin.
Yeah, I was imagining it was a scenario more like the new Ceramic Speed solid state bearing, where they don't feel, you can't necessarily with your finger turn the ball, but when they're under load, they do turn, and they do feel a little stiffer or like more resistant than your conventional ball bearing, but that's kind of by design in a certain way. So I'm imagining it's more like a scenario like that rather than like a plastic cage holding the individual balls in place.
Yeah, I don't think this is on an older bike, if I remember correctly. And I don't think...
I mean, Time definitely did like interesting things with their headset.
They did, but not so much with the bearings themselves, though, because the quick set adjustment thing is like this threaded... if I remember correctly.
There's one right.
Yeah, that's right. There's one right there.
Yeah.
As the case may be, with lots of Time logos on it. But yeah, it does sound like it's just sort of how you're just looking at the inside of a newer high end bearing, and it doesn't sound like there's anything wrong with it at all, especially if it's working properly.
Yeah.
All right, let's finish up with the last couple of questions here, and then we'll wrap it up because we're kind of at the hour mark here. This one comes from Edson. Again, I don't have their full name. Edson has a set of Roval CLX 50 carbon wheels with S-Works turbo tubeless tires. They seem to lose a lot of pressure during the day. So, for example, when they ride to work and after 8 hours, they've got to pump them up again. It starts out at 90 PSI and goes down 40 PSI or more. When they clean the bike or it rains, they're seeing it sweat a bit on the sidewalls. I don't know if this is the problem. Do we have any suggestions? And for clarification, he's using muck-off, or Edson, he or she or whatever, they're using muck-off sealant.
I would start by not using that sealant.
Mm-hmm.
Me too.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
But and then otherwise, there's like only so many variables, right? It's either the rim tape or the valve interface on the rim.
But it sounds like it's really pretty clear it's seeping through the sidewalls, just based on what they're seeing when they wash it.
That sealant is kind of like a sludge that doesn't really do anything instead of like fill gaps and seal things, in my experience. And it's just awful to clean out and do anything with.
Yeah. All right. I haven't used muck-off sealant, but it sounds like I don't
smells
really
like bubble gum. That's what their marketing is.
Yeah. That's a
real bubble gum might work better.
Yeah.
Ooh, ouch.
Sorry.
I would say like orange seal would be a really good sealant to test here, because orange seal basically like creates this this like latex barrier. You know, it really sticks around the whole tire, and it creates this this true like airtight liner to most tires. So that's where I would probably go and try before you start swapping tires and all that. But yeah, you'd want to get the muck-off sealant out of there before you went to orange seal.
I think, was it Ronan, I feel like, made a joke about muck-off products are made so they use other muck-off products to clean that first muck-off product.
Maybe something to that effect. Yeah. I just want to add that in my experience, particularly for tires that have already been ridden a fair bit, like even with ones that are somewhat challenging to seal, if you're using a good sealant, usually just the act of riding is enough to slosh the stuff around to kind of coat the inside of the casing, and you might lose a little bit of air on the first couple of rides or something, but eventually that stuff does slosh around enough to kind of get the whole inside of the carcass. But if you have been riding those wheels and tires for a little bit of time now and you're still having issues with the sidewalls not sealing, then yeah, I agree with everyone else that it sounds like it's a sealant issue. So switch.
It doesn't sound like this is the case, but I've definitely had it on older mountain bike tires where the sidewalls with age start seeping, where like you get like sidewall wear basically.
Oh no, these are pretty new.
Yeah, but if it's a new tire, then I'd be looking to the sealant first and foremost.
All right, let's wrap up this round of Ask a Wrench with one last tire question. This one comes from My Handle 1970 in the UK. I'm gonna guess they were born in 1970. Anyway, they have a 2016 Rose X-Lite CRS fitted with nominally 25 millimeter wide tires. What is the safe gap? What's the safe clearance needed around before they tried to run 28 mil tires? They're thinking it might be too tight, but they're wondering what the general advice is before deciding whether to try something wider. This is a tricky question to answer, mainly because there is such the tire sizing as far as like printed size versus actual size is just the absolute wild west, especially if you're looking at, comparing things that are a few years old with stuff that's new. That printed tire size is supposed to be what the actual inflated width is on what they call a reference rim. Back then, if you have that 25 mil tire, it probably was 25 mil on a quite narrow rim, assuming you're not changing the rims that you have right now. Nearly anything else that you run that you can buy nowadays will probably be designed around a wider reference rim and will be quite a bit bigger than what you have right now. So there might be some trial and error required here. But anyway, manufacturers on the road bikes anyway, they usually recommend for their maximum recommended tire clearances, they say that you have to have a minimum of 4 millimeters of clearance at any point anywhere in the frame or fork. I mean, you could go tighter than that, but I don't generally recommend it, especially if you're going to ride in the wet or mud or anything like that. One wheel that goes out of true or a broken spoke or anything, you can easily actually wear a hole in your frame. Dave, looks like you have something to add here.
Yeah, like just like there's so many variables here. Like, even the stiffness of your wheel or the stiffness of your frame can have a huge impact on the amount of clearance you can get away with. And then on top of that, like if you are constantly riding in the wet, which you probably are given your location, it's like, the amount of grit that you pick up also needs to be factored in. So I'd want more clearance. For if I was riding in poor weather with grit and gravel around, you'd want to probably err on the side of that 4 millimeter clearance, that ISO clearance, rather than tighten up that gap any further.
I would also say just keep an eye to a wider tire is also a taller tire, and you may run into brake caliper clearance if you're. I believe, I'm not sure. You said it was a Rose frame. If that's if that's a
yep, from 2016.
Yeah, so if that's still, I presume that's probably a rim brake bike, and therefore also take an eye and just look at that gap too, because you'll gain at least as much, width as you would height, and therefore I've seen more clearance issues with brake calipers maybe than I have with frames in a scenario like this where it's a close call.
Yep. James, you did mention before that like the reference rim and that things will be wider. I guess just to clarify, like because the reference rims are wider, the tires themselves, if you put them on a narrower rim, the latest tires will actually probably end up.
Yes, they'll measure smaller. Excuse me.
They'll
Correct.
be smaller.
Sorry, Dave.
So
yep.
So like Continental, for example, like their latest 28s are narrower than their older 28 mil tires, given the same rim. So that's probably perhaps could be done to your advantage if your rims are narrower. You could use a 28 mil and it'll probably measure like 26 or 27 mil on a narrow rim. So
either way, certainly some trial and error will be required here.
Yes.
Maybe you will find an accommodating shop that will let you try some of those things to see what'll work. But unfortunately, there's not going to be like a surefire solution or answer as far as what will fit and what won't. But yeah, measure those clearances pretty carefully on your frame and gauge carefully how much risk you're willing to run there.
For the tip, Allen key is a pretty good measurement guide.
Ooh,
because you
that's
can.
a good one.
Yeah, they're much easier to get into tight spots than like a caliper, and you've got a full size range of them, and you can just slip them in and see how much room you got.
Oh, handy tip. All right, I think let's go ahead and wrap up there because I like finishing on that note there. So we are kind of out of time anyway for this special Ask a Wrench episode of Geek Warning. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard today, please head over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review so more people can geek out with us here. And again, if you're not a member of Escape Collective yet, I mean, what are you waiting for? I mean, seriously. So the show is over now. Head over to escapecollective.com/join and sign up. We do have subscriptions starting at just $7 US a month, which granted, I'm a little biased. I think it's a tiny, tiny, tiny price to pay. So you don't feel guilty about consuming this wonderful, joyous, gleeful podcast every week.
Easy for you to say. You haven't paid, James.
Neither of you.
That's true. Guilty.
Oh, but Dave, we have paid in different ways.
This is true. The perk of the job,
Anyway.
we get a subscription.
Exactly. Well, thanks again, and we'll see you next time. And we'll have to make sure we do another Ask Your Wrench episode sooner than later. What do you think?
Yeah. I think, truthfully, to tease it out a little bit, I think there's plans to do this on a very regular basis, and potentially even in addition to the regular weekly show. So we'll see how those plans end up. No promises, but that's where we're headed. So
there you go. So then you'll be getting even more for your money. You see, how's that for me piling on? See, I was raised by Asian parents. Can you tell? Anyway, thanks again. We will see you next week.
yeah.
Bye.